to my fieldwork project. I'm doing it about my very unique instrument, the Bohemian Bassoon. So I did this project because about a year ago, a very unique instrument came into my possession. It belonged to another student of my professor, Janet Polks. She said, "You should give it a shot. It's beautiful. It's very old." I played it for about 2 minutes, and immediately I was in love. And I thought about it off and on for the next 3 years. Until at the end of my first year of college, I came back home and I visited Janet, and she said, "Oh, by the way, the student who used to play that Bohemian Bassoon is on a new instrument. Do you want to try out the Bohemian?" I brought it home that day, and it's never left my possession since. But I didn't know much about it. All I knew was that it was old and beautiful. And the maker's stamp gave me a lot more clues. So this is the maker's stamp. There's maker's stamps in both Czech and English all over the instrument. So this one says, "Vykolet son, Graslitz." Graslitz was in Bohemia, which is a country that stopped existing during the First World War. So then I realized that this was much older than I recognized. So just to give us some background, I'm going to show you a brief history of the bassoon. So the bassoon is an aerophone played with a double reed, 2 pieces of cane back to back that vibrate against each other to create sound. The earliest one we can see, though it's very questionable and murky, is a fagotum, first seen around 1532. This is an example of a fagotum. It's got the same idea of a bassoon, a U-shaped instrument where the sound turns around at the bottom and comes back up. We've got the little metal bogle, we have a bell at the top. Another similar instrument, especially in terms of sound and range, is the serpent. Serpent was played with a metal reed mouthpiece hybrid, but the idea of having specific holes for each finger rather than just a wide series of holes is where we see the connection to the bassoon. By 1600s, we start to see the Baroque bassoon, which had 6 main holes, 3 for the left hand and 3 for the right, as well as 4 keys. The bassoons at this point were now double-walled. They had the outside wooden wall that everyone sees when they look at the bassoon, and they had the interior wall called the bore, which is the most important element of the bassoon for sound production. By 1800, we're up to 8 keys, and this is also the first time we see a seat strap, which is how a lot of bassoonists hold their instrument up. They sit across the strap, which has either a hook or a cup on the end for the bassoon to sit in or connect to. So after 1820, we're now in what's called the classical era, especially for bassoons. So the classical bassoon still has the 6 holes. That doesn't change throughout the entirety of the bassoon's life. We're up to about 16 to 18 keys, as well as keys to cover the lower octave, which is a lot less difficult to navigate for sure. Heckel, one of the finest bassoon makers to this day, comes onto the scene in 1829. It's worth noting that at this point, bassoons are still unlined, meaning that they're not protected from moisture. Any sort of condensation from blowing warm air into a cold instrument can seep right into the wood. The second generation of Heckel, in the 1870s, creates a uniform bore, which means that interior wall of sound is the same diameter all the way down and up, creating a much more level tone and an easier access of sound all the way up and down the range. There are French bassoons being made at this point, but the French bassoon is such a different instrument that it's not worth getting into here. So today's bassoons, same number of holes, as I've said. We're up to 24 plus keys. Some bassoons have more keys or added options to easier facilitate the upper register or playing for smaller hands. And there's also new techniques. We've got the new German bassoons, which have created a connection between certain joints that used to be separated. The bassoon comes together and apart, but now they're connected because then less air can leak if there's fewer connection points. You can also have a bassoon made custom, anything you want on it in terms of additional keys, built to the size of your hands. Of course, those are very, very expensive. There's also new materials. A lot of student bassoons these days are being made out of polypropylene, a type of super durable plastic, which is less moisture susceptible and less damage susceptible. A sort of funny example is somebody tried making a glass bassoon about 20 years ago. Didn't catch on for obvious reasons. So now we're on to the Kollert flat top, which is my bassoon. It's called a flat top because of the shape of the ring at the top. It's flat with the instrument rather than raising up or down. So the Kollert makers were fine bassoon makers established in Graslitz, Bohemia. This is a very rich area for bassoon makers. Heckel had a factory near there, Monig and Puchner did as well. So the first generation was Vincenz Kollert. He set up the factory in 1840. His sons carried it on, V. Kollert's son, and that's the era from which my instrument derives. The Kollert flat top is considered an inexpensive version of the 4000 series Heckels, which is the professional models that Heckel was making at the time. According to bassoon expert Will Jansen, the only makers of the time to mass-produce instruments while still maintaining quality rather than more of an artisan approach are the Kollerts. By World War II, things got a little difficult. Graslitz was part of the Sudetenland, but while the factory wasn't outright destroyed, bassoon production essentially ceased. The third generation of the brothers, struggling after the war, were bought out, and they became workmen in their own factory. The fourth generation tried to start a new factory in West Germany, like many other bassoon makers of the time, but it was unsuccessful because they had jumped on the saxophone bandwagon and were making less than stellar saxophones rather than decent bassoons. Hoping to rescue the factory, American wholesalers offered the brothers some contracts, mostly for making saxophones, but because their saxophones were so poor, they were unable to earn a profit. But of course, the contracts were binding, and the brothers' hands were tied. By 1967, the Kollert factory was bankrupt. A German industrialist bought it, decided it wasn't worth the trouble of trying to get it started again, and sold it to Bernd Mussmann, who now has factories in both the United States and in Germany. So my bassoon was made in 1911, according to Bernd Mussmann himself, who told me that the last year of production for this particular flat top was 1911, and it's unlikely that any bassoon from any earlier would still be surviving. Its initial state was unlined, so moisture, it could have very easily been damaged by moisture. Luckily, it was not. It's also what's called a romantic bassoon. It was built to accommodate the sound ideals of the Romantic era, think Beethoven, Brahms, and Dvorak. So it's very soft. It's ideal for solo and chamber performances. However, because of that softness, the sound emanates from the instrument rather than coming out in a concentrated sound, which means it cannot really be heard in a larger setting. The best reed for a Kollert flat top, according to experts, is one with a wide throat and a flat tip. This is now called a German or a Heckel shape, which makes sense because they all came from the same region. So, a brief little family history of who's owned this bassoon before me. It was built in Graslitz, 1911. In the 1940s, it came to Boston, Massachusetts, with Raymond Allard, a French bassoonist who performed with the Boston Symphony at the time. Monsieur Allard gifted the bassoon to the father of Frank Belizia, who was a friend of my professor's, Janet Polk. From 1970s to about 2011, Frank Belizia did not play the instrument. His father was the one who knew how to play, and it languished in a closet, alone and forgotten. Till Janet purchased it in 2011, she told me it was in a rough state, but she felt that it had potential. It was overhauled by Jonathan Ranney, who added a lining to protect it from further moisture damage, demolded the keys, luckily the interior had not been affected, and generally got everything working again. I purchased it in 2018, after the other student had played on it for about 3 years. So now I'm going to give you a brief sound comparison. This instrument on the left here is my Fox. It was built in 1986. It's a good bassoon. It's a nicer end student bassoon, but still a student instrument. And then, of course, I'll play the Bohemian. I'll play an F major scale and the opening of the Mozart Bassoon Concerto on each instrument. As I mentioned earlier, most bassoonists play with a seat strap, but I'm playing with a neck strap so that I can have a little more mobility. fox is a little more robust and a little more stable. But for me, sometimes that comes across as dull and stodgy. The Bohemian is more vibrant, even though, as you could probably hear, it's a lot more difficult to get things to come in the right pitch and where they're supposed to. But for me, it's worth it because it's so much more vibrant and lifelike. So why does any of this matter? Well, for me, it sparked a realization that the personal connection to my instrument was a hugely important factor into how I played. So most wind instruments don't age well. It's sort of the nature of the instrument. If you're blowing warm air into a cold instrument, you're very susceptible to moisture, or in the case of metal instruments, the metal wears out and just doesn't sound good. It loses its tone after a while. So wind instruments get better with time, and because the bassoon only has moisture go through the first half of the instrument thanks to the U at the base, a lot of bassoons can actually be preserved, provided the bore is even enough that you can manipulate how you play to get into an even pitch. So I asked my studio mates what they felt about this idea of adapting instruments or personal connection. Everyone said that you need to get to know your instrument over time. You cannot just sit down and perform on a foreign instrument. They feel off, or like wearing someone else's shoes. When I asked them what their dream instruments were, they didn't say, ooh, I want a 12,000 series Heckle, or I want a professional Fox. They said, I want one that sounds gorgeous, or I want one that really sings in the upper octave. For me, I wanted this one because it's the one that got away. I never thought I'd get a chance to play it again. When I asked my teacher, she said, I have my dream bassoon. She's got a 1930s Heckle that she's had for about 40 years now. So what about you? If you play an instrument, do you have a connection to it? So then I asked some people that weren't just bassoonists, and many, but not all, said that they felt a personal connection. They said things like, it's one of my best friends, or I could never discard of it. Those who did have a personal connection said that it came down to experience, which is something I too identify with. I've had my Fox for almost a decade. We've done everything together. We've gone to Allstate, gone on tour of Europe, did all my college auditions. So for me, it's a very important instrument in my own personal history. Those who didn't have a connection often cited problems, saying, oh, I don't like how it sounds, it's too brassy for me, or I really struggle to get notes to come out in the upper octave and I don't like that. Though just about everybody, even if they didn't like their instrument, said that playing a different instrument felt weird or wrong. Unfortunately, very few people are playing their dream instrument at this point, according to my survey. However, those who said they are have been playing for a very long time, so maybe it's something that we can all strive for. So this really sparked a jumping off point for me. I hope to do more research into bassoon makers of this time, bassoons of this time, and other historical bassoons going farther back, such as Baroque and Classical. I also realized that being able to trust your instrument is a very important part of how we play. It's sort of like when you're playing a duet, you need to trust your partner. Well, your instrument is your number one partner. Especially if you're a music performance major, you spend more time with your instrument than with almost anything else. So for me, it helped me to realize that loving my instrument makes me a better bassoonist. So these are all my sources. Most of the photos were taken by me over the years. Any that weren't had URLs attached. Thank you so much.